Hi, welcome to another special segment that I'm hosting. My name is Kevin Tocci, and in these times, these unprecedented times, information is king. It's paramount. And so, what I've been doing is the many professionals that I know, the folks who are in the know, who understand this information, the information I'm sharing. I'm just a facilitator. I'm the one who's asking the questions. The gentleman who is joining me today, he calls himself a trial attorney, but he's also well-versed when it comes to constitutional law. He does these fantastic Facebook Live discussions called Chris Chat. The gentleman who's joining me is Chris DiOrio. He's a good friend. There's many other things that we can discuss, and you've probably seen he and I or heard us do conversations in the past. Chris, thank you very much for your time here with me today.
Kevin, thank you for having me again.
So the idea of us having this conversation is very time sensitive, knowing that we are dealing with this pandemic that is known as COVID-19, the coronavirus, and very slowly we're being asked to not only keep our distance from each other, but also there's been discussions about shelter in place.
Right.
There's been conversations about should the federal government step in and enforce some type of martial law. Mm-hmm. And you recently hosted a Facebook where you actually took questions from the folks. I don't know if folks understand what types of rights we have or how we may lose our rights depending on acts that our president or our governor may utilize during this time of crisis.
Sure.
If you want, let's start on the state level with Governor Charlie Baker basically asking non-essential folks to stay at home. But I think the governor said something that was kind of key, and that was that he would not ask Americans, U.S. citizens, to shelter in place or for them to remain home. They didn't have that type of enforcement. Did you hear that?
I did, and I have both his order, his statement from yesterday, which is both an order and an advisory. When he refers to businesses and creating his Exhibit A of what they have deemed to be essential, as opposed to non-essential businesses, and ordering that non-essentials be shutter and close their brick and mortar facilities by noon today, March 24th, and remain closed until April 7th. That has the effect of an order. If you violate that, when an executive issues an order, it becomes tantamount to law. And that means if you break that law, you can be sanctioned criminally or civilly. There are different sections of the Mass General laws that allow for that type of punishment. So these businesses, if they choose to violate these shutdown orders, they can be prosecuted. What he's referring to in terms of individuals is he's asking the Department of Public Health to issue guidelines and advisories. In essence, he's asking people to use their own judgment to stay home. When you do that, that doesn't have the effect of law. So if I decide to gather someplace, with a person on the street, I can't be made to go back in my home. But if I'm gathering in a building, say a church or a gymnasium, and if the Y in East Bridgewater or wherever were to open back up and allow people to congregate there, because that business is doing it, that business can be prosecuted under, as a misdemeanor at least.
So I would ask you this: is who would enforce that? Is that, I know that he had called in the National Guard. There might be 2,000 of them,
right?
But would they be the ones who'd be enforcing it, or would this be something that is enforced by the local municipalities?
When it be no different than any other statement of law, it's local law enforcement that has the primary task of enforcing that law. The National Guard is put in place to assist. Until you have a circumstance where martial law has been declared, the military has no real interdiction powers. It all rests with local law enforcement. It's only if local law enforcement is unable to properly mete out, what's necessary. As we saw in the most recent declaration of law in the United States during Hurricane Katrina, where the looting and the rioting and things of that nature rendered local law enforcement ineffective. And at that point, the military had to step in. There's a federal, they federalized the National Guard in Louisiana to allow the federal government to take control. And then you had military on the streets enforcing justice. But first line of defense is local law enforcement, followed by state police, and then, by, if necessary, introducing National Guard forces into the mix.
When I heard something the President Trump had mentioned about a national emergency.
Right.
What happens during a national emergency? What should we be concerned about when it is something that is ushered in?
What you have to be aware of is that you're dealing with the federal government and state government both having a hand in doing this. Under the 10th Amendment, anything that's not reserved specifically to the federal government belongs to the states. So, and that means that they get to dictate what goes on inside their state as far as security and law enforcement and things of that nature. They're allowed to enforce their own laws. If the federal government decides to declare a national emergency, that frees up the ability to take certain funds, that it frees them up to take certain actions, including if they need to federalizing National Guard units, to activate National Guard units in individual states where they're required. As you saw a couple of days ago, the president activated the National Guard on his own in 3 separate states. It doesn't necessarily require the governor of the state to do it if there's a national emergency that's been declared or some national issue that needs to be addressed that requires the imposition of the National Guard. That can be done. So you're not just dealing with federal hands-on. You are also dealing with state hands-on, and there will come a point where they may collide and they may clash unless a state decides to ask for federal help. And that's what might happen in some of these states. If they're not able to take care of themselves, if they're not able to do these things on their own with law enforcement on the ground, then they may need to ask specifically for the federal government to come in, and that's when you're going to have more of a military presence.
When it comes to our rights as a U.S. citizen, could our rights be abridged by a national emergency?
By a national emergency, it's going to depend a lot on what happens as a result. What I used the example a while ago that back after 9/11, in 2001, we had a great tumult and a need for some degree of security. And what resulted was not just having boots on the ground, but a series of legislation packages that were passed through Congress that allowed for state and local authorities as well as the federal government to expand their law enforcement presence. Chief among them being the USA Patriot Act and other laws that still exist to this day. When you're looking at emergency powers and when you're looking at declarations of emergency or states of emergency, there's a tremendous amount of trust. You have to trust that at some point when these type of laws or ordinances are enacted, that once the state of emergency ends, that the people who enacted it will rescind it. There's a tremendous amount of trust that's involved. We had the Patriot Act that was put in place to protect us as a nation in a time when we were afraid, and the Patriot Act still exists. It's been reenacted. Multiple parts have been reenacted since President Bush, George W., and then President Obama re-upped provisions of the Patriot Act 19 times. But we weren't in a state of national emergency. They still do it, and we don't get to say anything about it other than choosing our legislators who would then say something. Most of the people, by the way, if you look at the history of the Patriot Act being enacted, we had almost unanimous voting for it in Congress. And if you go back and look at it, years after the fact, most of those legislators will tell you they never read it. That it was placed in front of them, that they read the first 2 pages, which are a synopsis of any bill, and then they just voted for it because they felt they needed to. And now we have, the NSA and PRISM being able to look into telephones and all of these other abrogations of our civil rights. So yes, short answer, your rights can be violated during this period of time, and you do have to be vigilant when you look at what the government is going to do in terms of how they respond in the name of protecting you.
It's interesting that you say that, because I know the one thing that we're watching for is, how the number of cases, positive cases, folks who were tested, who have it. We're also watching the fatalities from this pandemic. I know that both China and Italy, as of the recent days, they've seen a little bit of a decrease in the number of folks who've been tested positive and the number of fatalities to this, where the shelter in place is becoming effective. What happens moving forward here? Again, we're taking a page out of Chris chat here. What were some of the questions that folks were asking? Because again, we are in a time where this is uncharted waters for us.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest issues that people have to get over is that these actions are declarations of martial law. You have to be very careful when you're looking at what state and local governments are doing, what the federal government is doing, if you say that this is martial law.
Right.
In strict dictionary terms, martial law is the suspension of all civil authority and the imposition of military authority. So if you're saying that we're under martial law, that means that the military is in control of the area. They're acting as the police. They're not just acting as the police, they're acting as the courts, and they're acting as the legislature. They're in charge. Martial law is extreme. And it's not what we're doing right now. Individual degrees of control may vary. We don't have that right now, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, if at all. What you have, though, is the federal government does have the ability, in a state of public health crisis, to isolate individuals that might be harmful to others. That's their power. The state then has the power to do what Governor Baker did and what other governors have done throughout the country, and establish public health guidelines as to how people are going to behave and how they're going to act. You do have a lot of complaints, excuse me, about how is this going to affect our individual rights. And my statement and my answer to that is this has gone on for a long time, that we have issues where our individual rights have been set aside in terms of protecting the greater good. Justice Scalia, in 1990, in deciding a case, a religion case, in Employment Division versus Smith, stated that if a general law that applies to everybody that only tangentially affects your individual rights, in that case, religious practice, free exercise of religion. Right. If the general law only tangentially affects your right to exercise these individual rights, then the general law takes precedence and your rights have to take a second seat. In that particular case, it was dealing with people who were fired from a job because they were Native Americans, and as part of their Native American religious practice, they were ingesting peyote to see God. They tested positive for the drug. They were fired, went to get unemployment, and they were denied unemployment. So there was a federal law against ingestion of hallucinogenics, and so that federal law took precedence over their individual rights to practice religion. So I've seen people question me about, well, they can't shut our churches down because it's a violation of our First Amendment right to free exercise. Yes. But if it's a general law that applies to everybody, that is not specifically directed at your religious practice, then there was a companion case in Florida that passed a specific law saying that you could not kill animals for religious sacrifices. That particular law, that ordinance in Florida, was struck down because the law specifically was directed at a religious practice. So if you pass a general law that affects everybody, you can't kill people, say, What that also means is you can't throw virgins into a volcano to satisfy your God. So it's not that you can't kill people is a general practice law. You can't kill people because we don't want you throwing virgins into a volcano is a different statement entirely. So you have to make something general. That's what we have here. Your rights, your individual rights are important. You have to stand up for them. They don't necessarily go away, but they will get shoved aside in these circumstances because we have a general law that affects everybody. No right. Scalia went on in his decision in D.C. versus Heller that allowed for the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, to be treated the same as an individual right as your right to free speech, your right to free practice of religion, your right to be free in your homes. Your right to possess arms is protected as an individual right by, against the states. But he said something very important in that case. No right is absolute. You can speak and you have the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. You don't have the right to utter fighting words. You don't have the right to issue, to give state secrets, out into the world. Your right can be, abrogated. You have the right to, freedom in your home, but they have the ability to come in an emergency and secure people out of your home. You have the right to bear arms, but the federal government and the state governments have the right to regulate it. No right is absolute. So yes, it's perfectly understandable that you feel that you're being put upon by these particular regulations. But you do have to understand that there is a line. And at some point, your rights take a back seat to the greater good.
So I think the next thing I have to ask, knowing you're somebody who has been an appointed official, you have served your municipality as a public servant, serving previously on a finance committee.
Right.
We know that right now, this is coming at a point in time in a lot of communities that town elections, city elections, town meetings are held. Right. What are you watching for in regards to how or if these are going to be held, or if there's going to be something that is set up for folks still to be able to participate if they must move forward and we're still under this shelter in place or non-essential folks staying at home?
One question that I'm seeing people raise a lot is, considering that we are, a lot of towns have town meetings coming up. I know locally here we have town meetings scheduled at the beginning of May. Mm-hmm. And we don't know if we're going to be clear of this. By all estimates, we're likely not to be clear of this by then. But meetings are taking place with local finance committees, with city councils to finalize budgets. Local school committees and school departments are finalizing budgets, but they can't get together in a room now to do this. So, and folks are saying, well, how are you going to meet? Well, maybe they can utilize services like Zoom or other types of GoToMeeting or whatever it is that you can do that. Sure. The next question becomes, is this a violation of the open meeting law? How can, if these meetings are supposed to be noticed and people are going to be allowed to participate, how are people going to actually participate? If you look at the open meeting law, it means open. How do you redefine how to attend a meeting if you can't have access to that meeting in person? We're going to have somebody looking at what open meeting means in the grander scheme of a pandemic response where we can't put people in a room as they're supposed to. But we're going to need these things to be done because next year will come and we will need a budget. And unless communities are willing to really take it on the chin here and not do anything or just pass emergency measures once we're able to put people in a room again, whenever that's going to occur, we're going to have a lot of a flurry of activity coming in May and June, and maybe moving meetings into the summer and beyond to make things happen. But a lot of contracts are going to end on June 30th with state and local authorities, where you've got budgets that terminate, and they reach their end on June 30th and they begin a new fiscal year. That money has to be repurposed and refocused. How do we get that to happen? This is something that we have not had to deal with, ever. It's certainly not in my lifetime that I can recall. But now we are uniquely capable of expanding our ability to meet without actually being in the same room. But the law is going to have to reflect that. And right now, it does not. So somebody is going to have to step up either at the state legislature to allow for some type of emergency extension of what open meeting means, to try to make things continue on. We want to, business as usual is sometimes a blessing and a curse.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because you look at the past couple of years on the state level, where when the conference committee, members of the Senate and the House get together and they try to hammer out a budget for the next fiscal year, and sometimes it'll extend into the new fiscal year, and there is a provision that's in place that will allow by month to month that 1/12th budget can be put in place, right, until they are able to hammer it out. Do you foresee, again, not to, do you think moving forward, seeing that we're going through something that we've never seen before, that we might see godlike or acts of nature clauses if something of this level happens, that in fact this can be invoked for town meetings, for contracts, et cetera, et cetera?
You'd have to look, and this again is part of the hard work that's going to have to take place. You're going to have to look at all these contracts and see what they say. And if they don't say something, A, we have to remedy the current situation. And B, if we're smart about it, we have to then look down the road and say, what if this happens again, because this might happen again? And look how we got caught with our pants down with A, B, C, and Z. And we need to be better at doing something and maybe revamping or revisiting what open meeting means, what we do in terms of budgetary extensions, what we do to extend contracts for folks that are in charge of Department of Public Works or other contract employees with inside. Most of these people that are hourly employees, and then we've got salaried contract employees, and their contracts are going to end. They work on a year-to-year basis for the most part. It's rare that you have a city or town employee that is contracted for multiple years. So you've got to go looking at town administrator contracts and town manager contracts and seeing what we do. Can you re-up and just do something for a short period of time? Sure, I think that's the easy solution, but you have to look long term now and see how this is going to affect us down the road. And we have to be better at this. And we're uniquely suited at this point now. If this type of event occurred 20 years ago, the crippling effect of this would be tremendous, because we weren't suited to work at home. We weren't suited to do most of our jobs. I think one of the ancillary benefits of all of this is we're going to see just how unnecessary some of this, going to a brick and mortar building and doing your job is. Whether we're going to need to have great giant glass skyscrapers to have everybody go in and sit at a cubicle to do their work, when they could just as easily sit at home with a Whitman Fire Department sweatshirt on and do everything that I would do as an attorney, except going to court, which, by the way, the courts continue to be closed for everything except emergency business. And that's a separate issue entirely, which if you have questions about that, I'll be happy to answer, because that directly comes to me and that directly affects people's individual rights.
If you will, please expand upon that.
Yeah, I mean, the SJC issued orders. They've issued a few orders at this point now, 3 of them in the space of 7 days over the past couple of weeks, basically trimming down what the court system will do. The courts are open. You can physically go to a courthouse, but they will not let you in unless you have permission to be there and unless it's an emergency action that you need to take. So the normal business of the courts, where arraignments are taking place after someone's been arrested in a criminal case, where you have motion sessions or pretrial conferences, all of those things are deemed to be non-emergencies, and they've all been suspended. The only thing you can do is go to court to get an emergency restraining order or an emergency injunction, or in a child custody case to keep someone, to get an emergency order to keep them from leaving the state or the country, something that requires and has a designation of being an emergent matter. All trials have been suspended. You can't get a trial in front of a jury or a judge in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts right now. What that means is you've got people that have been sitting in jail on bail awaiting trial, and now they've got to wait some more. and all of this time doesn't count in terms of getting out of jail based on what they call speedy trial rules. You have to be brought, before and have the government declare themselves ready in order to try a case. All of this time is lost. And so these people are being held on bail, stay in jail, and they have to wait and wait, however long this takes. And that's lost time. So you cannot, this is stuff that they can't get back. And these individual rights of people who need to get something done and it can't get done because the court system is closed. Is it important to keep the court system closed? Yes, there's on any given day, hundreds and hundreds of people in close contact at any given time. But what we're also seeing is in prisons locally, at the House of Corrections, state prison facilities. I've got clients in federal prison in other states and in this state right now that cannot socially distance. It is nearly impossible to socially distance these people who are inmates. And many of them are over a certain age. So they're compromised both by being in close quarters, they're compromised by age, and there's nothing that they can do to save themselves. So my son is passing me the solar system. That's great. So these people sit in jail waiting, and there's nothing that they can do. Habeas corpus, for the most part, has been suspended by each individual state that has done this, including Massachusetts. There was a big hue and cry when the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, tried to enact some uniform law that would allow for individual judges at the state and local level to suspend business. And people said, "Well, we're violating habeas corpus." You are. And what I would say is it's already being done. All they were trying to do is unify it and make it a federally controlled, unified practice. Massachusetts, for the most part, has already suspended habeas corpus. You cannot get into court now unless it is an emergency. I can file divorce petitions from a distance. I can mail things in. I can do all of the things in the normal course. But I can't go get child support for a client. I can't go get a child custody order. I can't get somebody to leave the house if there's two parents still living in a home and there's discord. I can't go get a motion filed that will make one of those parents move out. The court system right now exists only for emergencies, and their order ends on April 6th. I'm interested to see what the SJC does, considering that the governor's order extends to April 7th, but he specifically exempts the judiciary because they operate on their own. So when Justice Carey and the rest of the first justice, the administrative justice, and all of the judges on the SJC get together again and sign off on this, which, by the way, if they all get together, they're violating the governor's orders, but so be it. But if they all get together and do this, I would be interested to see how they're going to extend this. My guess is they are going to extend it. And that means more people are sitting in jail, not able to get their rights, not able to a trial addressed, not able to, the prosecution rate on trials is not more. If you go to trial, it's a lot of times a 50-50 shot. There are these people that are in jail waiting for trial that shouldn't be there. And a jury will bear that out. But there they sit.
We talked about the municipal elections and town meetings. What about on the federal level? If this thing extends into the fall, I don't know if it will. How will this have an effect on some of the bigger races, the races for U.S. Senate, for Congress, for president?
We're uniquely suited to do a lot of this. I haven't gone a day without getting at least 2 or 3 emails from political candidates asking me for money. So they're still out there doing that. But the large scale traditional put 1,000 people in a rally and let's gin them up and do what we have to do and rally the troops, that can't happen. So what you have now is a new kind of race where these local elections are going to require people to actually get on social media and talk to people that way. I think we have to get candidates, if they're ahead of the game, are doing exactly what we're doing here. Having conversations with voters, saying we're going to set up a virtual town meeting and everybody, here's the address for it, and you can attend and you can ask questions and do everything that you could do in a room, you can do right here at home. And frankly, we should get ourselves moving forward on allowing people to vote from home. If we want to move into the next century, I know the governor's order said that polling places are exempt from these orders. So if you've got primary elections coming up, or if you've got local elections coming up and this order is extended, people are going to be allowed to go to polling places. We saw last week that 3 individual states had their primaries go forward. The governor, Mike DeWine in Ohio, decided to suspend their primary. Smart move, I would guess, Ohio being a large state. But for candidates, Ohio is a large electoral vote state. They would want, and their delegates are a huge pile of what they need. So on the Democrat side, it's Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders fighting for those Ohio delegates. Now they can't get them. They don't know where they are. We're all in limbo here. And it's very much a case of first impression when it comes to what we do with elections in this. So maybe somebody's got to be smart. And the candidate that's able to step up and take advantage of social media, take advantage of a decent broadband connection to reach out to people is going to be the one that really gets people in. Now, I'm saying that knowing full well that the candidates that remain in the race are all over 70 and probably don't know how to use email. I know one of them knows how to use Twitter pretty good, or at least pretends to. But it's going to take somebody, it's an intern or somebody in charge of campaign management that says, for a governor's race, for a local Congress race, for in the 8th district here, and we've got 3 people in a primary on the Democrat side. How are they going to reach out to voters? Whoever's the smartest one to reach out to voters is the one that's going to take advantage of this situation, and I think they should be lauded for it.
Is there any provision in the Constitution that could put off this election? Let's say things get dire come the fall, and we're still seeing an increasing number of folks who are positive for coronavirus, and the death toll is climbing, and we're more worried about having enough ventilators and masks for our medical professions. Is there any kind of provision to put off the election, the federal elections, until the national elections, until say 6 months or a year?
Constitutionally, no. Constitution refers to when elections take place, the day on which elections are to take place, and the only other mention they make is how many votes it takes and who the electors are going to be, the whole discussion of the Electoral College, and then it says that the new president's term begins on January 20th. Right? Okay. Why they chose the middle of winter is beyond me, and but so be it. But that's it. So what they do have, however, is they grant in Article 1 the ability for the legislature to create laws that will address these things. So what you would then need to have is Congress getting together and passing an emergency legislation that would suspend the election. Now, if they do that, technically you have to amend the Constitution, and a constitutional amendment is difficult because it's our foundational document, and the document says on January 20th, the new president, elected, takes office. That means that the old president's job ends, his contract ends on January 20th at 12 noon. So you've got to go about the process of some sort of emergency convention that would allow for that date to be extended, in essence, to extend the president's contract potentially. I think now, and then it becomes a political football, because if you're going to open up conventions to do this, it takes years to amend the Constitution. In order to do this in an emergency, it can't happen. You're going to have to get some bipartisan support on legislation that would allow for elections to be suspended, or to somehow allow for elections to be undertaken over the course of days. Perhaps the answer is to extend election day to election week and allowing people to come in on multiple days to minimize the amount of people coming to the polls on any given day. Perhaps that's a solution. Or coming up with a mode by which we can vote from home. I know there's legislation locally that's in the House that is pending, allowing people to file absentee ballots even though they don't meet the absentee ballot requirement. That they can go to their town hall, take a ballot, and send the ballot in so that they don't actually have to go in on election day. Normally, in order to get an absentee ballot, you have to show that you're going to be away and unable to vote. And we have early voting and things of that nature. Why can't they extend the ability to early vote to allow people to early vote from their residence, to keep people from having to go to polling places? Will it create other issues? Of course. But you're going to have people in City Hall and Town Hall counting these ballots individually and running them through the machines. But I would rather you have 9 people in a room running things through ballots over the course of time than having 1,000 or 2,000 people trotting through a room, and if this virus is still an issue at the time, creating more problems than it's worth.
Anything that we haven't mentioned during this conversation but you feel is important enough to make sure that we wrap up with?
I think you have to be aware of when you're looking at these individual laws that are coming up, what the governor is asking you to do, if the president decides to act on a national basis. First, you have to ask whether these laws really do serve a general public health or safety purpose. The next thing you have to get into is whether these laws that they're imposing are the least restrictive means available for the state to pursue this legitimate public health or safety objective. It's one thing to quarantine one individual. Is it necessary, however, to quarantine 10,000? You have to make sure that when you're doing these individual ordinances or pieces of legislation or executive orders, that they still have to address the fact that we have individual rights that need to be protected. And when you are violating individual rights, such as the right to assemble, such as the right to free speech, such as all the right to freely exercise, you have to still abide by these least restrictive means. That's you need this compelling state interest. You need the least restrictive means. They're gonna be. What I would do is I would appeal directly to individuals and say there are going to be a lot of hard cases here. The framework does not the framework we have does not provide all of the answers. We're years from now, those of us who remain, years from now, we're going to be arguing about the wisdom of all of this. This is going to be classroom textbook stuff. I'm going to be if I'm still here, I'm going to be teaching about this years from now. We're going to argue about the wisdom and legality of what the government did and how they responded to this for years. It does not hurt to remember, and what everybody should be aware of. The state does have these police powers, and that's what they're called. The state has these police powers. They are not unlimited, and they never are and never should be. Even in the midst of a pandemic, you do have individual rights, and you do have to make sure that you stand up for them. It doesn't mean that, that means run out into the street and, go quickly, set up a pickup basketball game at the Y, but use good judgment, use good sense, but understand that while they may say that they're trying to help, make sure that any of these emergency measures that are perfectly justifiable today or tomorrow or next week or next month, at some point they will become constitutionally suspect. And when they do, and when things change, it is paramount that we act to return things to a normal footing as soon as the crisis has either lessened or passed us by. That's what we have to be ready for. That's what people need to be vigilant for. That's what people need to be aware of.
Well, my guest for this segment has been Chris DiOrio, a trial attorney specialized in constitutional law as well. Chris, I want to thank you very much. And as the need arises, I'd like to have you back on if we need to provide any updates to the folks who are checking this out.
We are fluid, we are fluctuating, and things are changing as we go, day-to-day basis. So as things change, when people have questions, I'll hopefully have answers. Thank you very much for having me, Kevin.
You got it. And thank you very much for checking out this latest segment. My name has been Kevin Tocci. Thank you for tuning in.